Project 2 presentation by Haiti Rivera and Chase Mullen. So for our project, we decided that we were going to be comparing mortality of tuberculosis and GDP, and we obtained these data sets from gapminder. And while getting these data sets, we wanted to see what type of relationships we could find. So we came up with these questions asking, how does GDP affect the rate of mortality of tuberculosis? How does GDP and TDP differ across the continents? And how much the rate of mortality changed between 1992 and 2007. We were mostly interested in finding the GDP and the rate of mortality of tuberculosis across different types of variables and how it affects it. In summary of our findings, we found that countries of lower GDP have higher rates of death of tuberculosis. We also found that a continent like Africa, GDP wouldn't play a high role of tuberculosis death.
Okay, so here we see our rate of mortality compared to GDP. On this side we have the log of our tuberculosis deaths and our GDP over here. We see that as the GDP gets higher, tuberculosis gets lower. This is a decent correlation that's in the negative area. We'll have to talk later about the values of these correlations.
So for our next question, we were comparing just the year 2007 and the rate of mortality of tuberculosis. So as we can see here across the different continents, they have different types of relation of the regression line. So we can tell that the different type of slopes of the regression line for each continent indicates how strong the relationship of GDP and TDP in each continent. So in the Americas, it wouldn't be, GDP affects it more.
Okay, so here is the graph of 2007, but here we're also comparing 2007 and 1992, the earliest and latest data points we could find for these data sets. As we look at the two, there is not all that much visible difference, but in running a correlation of the lines, we see here that for our 2007 data, we get a negative 0.362, which is actually a fairly weak correlation. This is compared to the 1992, which is negative 0.443, which is more of a moderate negative correlation. This shows us that in 1992, there was the GDP more strongly influenced the rate of death from tuberculosis. We also went a step further and made a model of these lines.
So for these models, we were going to calculate the slope. So to do this, we found R square, which is 26%, and this 26% is the variation in the response variable, so tuberculosis death, and it can be explained by the log of GDP. So we found the equation of TB deaths to be negative 20.63 plus 218.801 log GDP. What this means is that for every unit dollar of log GDP is a decrease of 20.6 deaths. So as we can see here, there is a decrease, and there would be a 20.6 of deaths per 1,000 people, 100,000 people.
We also went ahead and looked at the error rate. So up here we can see these red dots that represent predicted values, and the model we made allowed us to not only get a prediction, but to compare that prediction to the actual values seen, and we could get the error. This graph represents that. Red was going to show the error from the 1992 data, and blue 2007 data. The biggest thing we notice here is that Africa has a lot of error. And you can see quite a bit in Asia here as well. Now these countries here, they have a few outliers, but the main centers here are very, very tight. And also having right around zero. What this shows us is that in these particular countries, GDP plays a larger role in determining how many deaths per 100,000 people occur. However, in these countries, particularly in Africa, it is not as representative. You can't just use the GDP to assume what the tuberculosis deaths may be, as is pretty obvious. I mean, there's some serious outliers going on here.
So, in conclusion, from all the data that we have presented to you, we can conclude that we found that as GDP increases, the rate of mortality for tuberculosis decreases. Across the continents, we can see different slopes of regression line. The slope you have will indicate how strong the relationship of GDP and TBD is in each continent. The error values and slope indicate that GDP have less of an impact in Africa than in the rest of the continents on the rate of mortality of tuberculosis, and that GDP affected TBD deaths more in 1992 than it did in 2007.